So thank you, Anusha, for the introduction and for organizing this kind of meeting. It's nice. So I'm happy to share with you my last thoughts that have been published in Frontiers in Psychology. It's very recent, and so I want also to acknowledge the two reviewers who contributed a lot to these ideas that I'm going to present. So it's a bit different. Since I'm not going to present data, so it's sometimes it's nice not presenting data and not only ideas, and especially on this topic of misophonia that is fascinating, and it's maybe in a field of psychology, psychiatry, and so on. So yes, so I'm gonna read a text so that is extracted from the paper that I just published and I just mentioned. And indeed, so the title is Did Kant, so the great German philosopher, suffer from misophonia? So the definition of misophonia, so you know this, but just to remind you, so misophonia can be defined as a disorder as it's associated some trigger reactions, impose substantial impairment in functioning, and or psychological distress. So in brief, misophonia is a disorder of decreased tolerance to specific sounds. Misophonia is, however, not recognized as a disorder in any medical or clinical classification system. It's not, for instance, it's not included in the DSM. These sounds are generally produced by humans, as you know, and are often associated with the acts of eating, breathing, coughing, expectorating, and or blowing one's nose, but not always. Animal vocalizations, like barking, for instance, or the sound of objects like fridge noise can also be misophonic triggers. So that is also important to have this in mind. So I will briefly mention so the putative mechanisms of misophonia, and I'm going to develop or just to present a model that you know already, I guess, and it's the model of Powell-Jastreboff. And so I could see that Powell was attending this meeting. So from the early 2000 years, in 2000, I mean, and the first description of misophonia, so Jastreboff proposed a mechanism for the disorder that is copied from that of tinnitus. And I quote Powell. So finally, the systems and mechanisms outlined above for tinnitus are the same for misophonia, where the tinnitus-related neuronal activity is replaced by activity evoked by external sounds. So I just want to recall here, so one of the fundamental principles of the Jastreboff model for tinnitus. Tinnitus-related, and I quote Powell, tinnitus-related neural activity acts as a stimulus, and the reaction evoked by activation of the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system acts as reinforcement. Consequently, when the initial association between tinnitus perception on one side and some negative events happening at the same time develops, the reflex loop is rapidly enhanced as both stimulus and reinforcement are continuously present. So briefly, classical conditioning was developed, establishing an association then between the misophonic stimulus, so that is initially neutral, according to Jastreboff, and the affective reaction, anger and disgust. The repetition of the association between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response increases the functional connection between the different regions of the brain involved in the processing of information, that is the auditory system and the autonomic limbic nervous system. According to this model, the negative reinforcement exacerbates any negative emotional or physiological state, and any sound can become misophonic trigger. That is very important. Following the rules of creating conditioned reflexes, Misophonia can be created even if a subject is neither aware of the presence of misophonic trigger nor what is responsible for negative reinforcement. There is no need for any causal link between stimulus and reinforcement. Time coincidence is all that is needed, and the condition reflex is always created. So this suggests, it's my understanding, that the misophonic trigger and the reaction, they are first completely independent, okay? Yep. So the theory says nothing about the overwhelming prevalence of sounds from the mouth, the throat, or the breathing among the trigger sounds. What is described in the literature tends to suggest that the association between the condition stimulus and the condition response is accidental or contingent. The unfortunate concomitance of the two events only intensifies the pleasantness or unpleasantness aspect of a sound. So as we shall see below, the hypothesis developed by myself, so in the article I just published, aims to complete this explanation and also to provide a slightly alternative view. While accepting that the learning and conditioning mechanisms proposed by Jastrzębów and others play a major role in misophonia, I believe that misophonic sounds are not neutral and that they act themselves as a negative reinforcer. Indeed, we suggest that misophonic sounds have acquired a negative valence as a consequence of social learning and the resulting perceived world. Humans do not look at the world with naked eyes, but through glasses shaped by the social environment. The brain is not a tabula rasa, waiting to be sculpted by the mechanisms of learning and conditioning at an adult stage of life. So is already pre-formatted, conditioned by a social environment that deposit concepts and symbols within him and which structures his mind. The social environment, so including other human beings, play a major role, as important as the physical world around him. Ultimately, misophonic sounds are perceived as a disorder in a world perceived as ordered. And a similar hypothesis has been developed for tinnitus. Tinnitus, it can be considered as an anomaly, a turbulence, a disorder, is all the more salient, the more it is present in the midst of a world perceived as ordered. We will see later that the increasing ordering of the world by concept and symbols is a fundamental trend in human history, fueled by social forces. Tinnitus and misophonic sounds are sources of disorder as long as they have not been integrated, put in order into the perceived ordered world. In this context, counseling or psychoeducation, which aims to demystify both tinnitus and misophonia, can help to integrate tinnitus and misophonic triggers into the normal, organized, perceived world. So I'm going to enter into, in more detail into our hypothesis now. And so it's already 10 minutes I talked, so it's going to be faster. So one of the striking aspects of misophonia is that the sounds that produces intense discomfort do not appear to be just any sounds in everyday life, as nonetheless been evoked in literature. On the contrary, it would appear that misophonic sounds belong to a cluster of sounds which can be grouped according to certain common characteristics. These characteristics are fundamental for understanding misophonia. The first characteristic is that they are generally produced by humans. Some others, however, report that the subject can be bothered by sounds produced by animals and so on, as I mentioned before. This property is, however, not enough to group the misophonic sounds, since not all the sounds produced by humans give rise to misophonia. The second characteristic of these sounds is that they are produced during specific situations more often, and often conforming the social norms that are relatively strict and restrictive, which oblige individuals to restrain the production of these sounds. In an online survey where we questioned misophonic subjects regarding trigger sounds, we found, so in the paper published with my former PhD, Falco Hensler, we found that 93% of subjects were bothered by at least one noise from the mouth, so chewing and so on. Some subjects were bothered by other sounds, but they were linked to breathing and the throat. Only one subject out of a total of 75 was only bothered by repetitive sounds that were not a priori linked to the mouth, the nose, the throat, or the breathing. Often the misophonic sounds are therefore associated with behaviors that are under a kind of social prohibition, that is to say, that should be repressed to avoid bothering anyone. Eating, breathing noisily, clearing the throat. In other words, some misophonic sounds could be related to an attitude that is inappropriate and unacceptable according to the social norms. We will see later that other norms can play a role if we have time. Repetitive sounds, repetitive clicking of a pen, for example, may be considered as a kind of generalization of behaviors that should be repressed to avoid bothering anyone. It is also possible that the physical characteristic of the sound may play a role in the discomfort felt by the subjects. We don't felt it was necessary to have recourse to an assessment grid from sociology in order to go further in our understanding of misophonia and its origins. Sociology studies social phenomena, that is, the relations, actions, and perceptions which emerge dynamically from human interactions. The individual within the society is not only part of the whole, one of its autonomous elements, is always a society in miniature. We cannot speak of the individual and societies as if we were speaking of a table and a chair, independent and opposite objects. One of the characteristics of human beings is furthermore their extreme plasticity in phase with the social environment in which they develop. They may be a peasant in this or that place and time, or an aristocrat in this or that other context. After a sufficiently early and long period of learning, it would nevertheless be difficult for a peasant to acquire the social codes of the aristocracy and vice versa. The issue here is not to go back in detail over the results and conclusions known and brought up to date by research in sociology, but rather to sketch out the broad traits of the social dynamics that may play a role in a disorder such as misophonia. The social rules and norms are not immutable. They are not floating around somewhere waiting to be deposited in the people's minds. They are, on the contrary, subject to change in the course of a dynamic processes without any beginning or end, without any purpose, and involving human interdependencies at various scales. The social norms are only crystallized and transitory states in these processes which become the focus of the perceptions of sociologists at MIT. The general question which interests us is to know whether there exist social processes which play a role in the onset of misophonia, and if so, to describe them. Furthermore, we wonder whether it might be possible to detect a tendency running through history in the evolution of the social processes which might lead to the present-day emergence of the disorder. So I'm running out of time already, so I have a big part on the civilization of manners, and it's actually inspired by books from the famous sociologist and philosopher Norbert Elias. But I'm going to go directly through another part, and through so the part that a chapter that I called misophonia, so turbulence in a perceived world. So we now come to the question of knowing how the social processes may play a role in the emergence of misophonia. We have seen with Norbert Elias that the pacification of relations between people linked to their interdependence over history imposed an ever-increasing number of social rules, among which the courtesy of the courts was the laboratory. Whereas certain rules consist in hiding certain situations, nudity, sexual relations, and so on, others codified social situations, for example, table manners. These rules, which were initially simple precepts, advice on good behavior in time, become injunctions or even taboos associated with a huge affective dimension. After the generalization of the fork and the handkerchief, eating with the hands, spitting on the table, blowing one's nose in one's clothing, clearing the throat, became forbidden behaviors, strictly controlled, and with a strong emotional connotation. The suppression of these behaviors was achieved at the cost of a strong association between the actions to be repressed and the whole repertoire of negative feelings: fear, shame, disgust. So it is striking to note that our own saliva does not produce disgust as long as it is in our mouth, and that it becomes repugnant if it is spat out into our hand. We know that the mouse is the visible boundary between the outside and the discussing inside of the body, saliva secretions from the nose, and so on. It is therefore not surprising to find sounds from the mouth, chewing, swallowing, clearing the throat, and so on, among the most prevalent misophonic sound triggers. Of course, the sounds or behaviors that become taboo depend very much on the culture of the society. In Japan or China, for example, it's not impolite to eat noodle soup while making a lot of noise, whereas it is, at least in France. Conversely, it is impolite to wear perfume in Japan, where it is not the case in France, because it is in Japan interpreted an individualist behavior. Spitting in the street is widely regarded as a very impolite and disgusting in France, for instance, whereas it is broadly tolerated in China. The collateral damage of the pacified society of today, regulated and individualistic, is the permanence of the social prohibition toward oneself, that is reflected in the fear and anguish of breaking the rules, and toward others by heightened sensitivity toward their behavior, toward the possibility that they may transgress the rule. Our hypothesis is that the origins of misophonia are to be found in this social conditioning, with the addition of an exaggeration. Misophonia may be seen as a heightened sensitivity to the failings of others with regard to their obligations of good behavior and considerateness, and taking food is just one example among many. In other words, social rules organize and structure the perceived world, and are therefore a possible origin of human sensitivity to factors that add disorder to his perceived world, which are not integrated into the perceived world then. The misophonic sound does not only trigger simple disapproval vis-à-vis the breach of the rules, but on the contrary, a strong feeling of disgust, indignation, anger, even protestation. What is at play in a misophonic subject is the intimate way they experience the breach of the rules. The breach of the rules must be interpreted in three different but not clearly separated and largely overlapping contexts. So I'm already at 20 minutes, so I cannot develop other points to leave enough time to Patrick for his presentation. So unfortunately, well, so I hope I could present a clear picture of the hypothesis. I can go directly to the conclusion. Yeah, it's the first time I read a text, so I didn't know about the time. General conclusion. So in this presentation, we have attempted to present an explanation of the origin of misophonia. This hypothesis should be seen as providing a different perspective on misophonia from that of the cognitive sciences. Okay. So we suggest that misophonia is the result of a disturbance in the relationship to the world or in the organization of the world, where a sensory element, that is acoustic in that case, failing to be integrated into the harmonious perceived world, and then is a source of turbulence. So we also believe that the psychology has everything to gain by distancing itself from positivism and its fetishism of the fact without abandoning the empirical and scientific approach. So just a last paragraph, briefly. So we argue that human beings are shaped by social forces, that these forces act on a mind that has its own structures and mechanisms, so learning and conditioning. As far as social forces are concerned, the pressure of modern society values individualization, autonomy, self-fulfillment, and at the same time, self-control and order in the perceived world, which can lead in extreme cases to an exaggerated sensitivity to disorder, immorality, and vulgarity. The disorder may appear gradually, starting from a repeated situation, probably often a family one, that is difficult to escape or avoid through the mechanisms of conditioning. Misophonic triggers, which have already acquired a negative connotation, so through initial social conditioning and or thought structure, may actually become misophonic triggers after further, often social conditioning. And the emotional reactions are generalized and spread with very few exceptions to other situations and people producing the trigger sounds. Thank you very much.